Good evening. I want to thank the U.S.-China Policy Foundation for convening this event. We seek to provide perspective on President Nixon's February 21 to 28, 1972 visit to China and the process that produced the Shanghai Communique. The communique was the trip's most important product, notable in the annals of diplomatic history for combining a clear statement of where both China and the United States differed and where they had common interests of sufficient magnitude to set aside those differences. The communique laid the basis for peace and broad and dramatic expansion of ties between the United States and China for the next half century. That's a long time in diplomatic history. In making his journey, President Nixon was the first US president to visit the People's Republic of China. The president's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had made preceding trips to Beijing in 1971 to break the ice and negotiate key aspects of the president's visit. The Nixon trip resulted in what the United States calls its One China policy, admittedly elaborated over time. To appreciate the magnitude and consequences of the visit, the meeting with Chairman Mao and the final negotiation and signing of the Shanghai Communique requires some context. It is only with that context that the significance of the Nixon trip and the Shanghai Communique can be fully appreciated. This context also provides background to understand part of what is going on wrong in bilateral relations as we speak today. The Cold War had been very expensive for both the United States and China from 1950 to 1966. The two biggest hot wars of the Cold War had been fought in Korea and Vietnam. Both involved Americans in direct and proxy combat with the People's Republic. Moreover, once these conflicts had become protracted, American popular support for the conflicts eroded dramatically, putting pressure on politicians to extricate America from the quagmires. From Mao Zedong's perspective, in the period preceding the trip, the Soviet Union was building up forces in the Russian Far East along the extended Sino-Soviet border. Moscow had used force against China in 1969 and was sending up trial balloons about taking out China's nuclear facilities. China was feeling vulnerable. Just parenthetically, earlier in the 1960s, Washington itself had considered and rejected the idea of trying to take out the PRC's nuclear program as Beijing approached its first test of an atomic device. In short, Mao had good reasons to reduce China's strategic vulnerability. Both Nixon and Mao, therefore, wanted to give Moscow something else to worry about strategically, given that both leaders saw the Soviet Union as their principal threats. Nixon also hoped that moves towards China would incentivize the Kremlin to be more receptive to strategic arms limitation talks, and the US president was talking about building a, quote, structure for peace, end quote, essentially an advantageous balance of power with China to help stabilize the regional and eventually global systems. There also was a domestic logic, as suggested earlier. Nixon was looking ahead to the 1972 general election in America and running in a peacemaking role after the exhaustion of Americans with the Vietnam War. He hoped Beijing would exert pressure on Hanoi to reach a peace agreement with Washington and provide the United States with a face-saving exit from Vietnam, the decent interval, as it was called. To put it bluntly, in the end, in 1975, when the US exited Vietnam, there was no decent interval and little discernible pressure was applied on Hanoi by China. With respect to his Vietnam-related hopes, Nixon was largely disappointed. For his part, domestically, Mao hoped that moving toward the United States would take steam out of what remained of the Cultural Revolution. In short, Nixon and Mao each had complex domestic and international calculations. But at this moment, their respective goals had substantial overlap. Taiwan was the biggest challenge, a subject to which I will return momentarily. Personality played its role in these events as well. Between Mao, Nixon, Premier Zhou Enlai, and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, there was an historic coming together of realist foreign policy thinkers and leaders from both countries. For them, ideology took a back seat to interests. As he planned for the trip, Nixon could hardly have been clearer about his understandings of American interests, writing in his preparatory notes for the trip that, quote, "What do we want, question mark? 1, Indochina, meaning getting out of Vietnam. 2, the communists to refrain from Chinese communist expansion in Asia. 3, in the future, reduce the threat of a confrontation with the Chinese superpower." In my view, many discussions of this period, Nixon's desire to avoid a future big power struggle with an increasingly strong China has not been fully appreciated. Nixon's discussions about Taiwan can be understood better in this light. Nixon knew that Taiwan was the key issue for the Chinese. The core of what Nixon and Kissinger were willing to provide Beijing was assurance that the United States would not support Taiwan independence or any permutation of it. However, in the context of the upcoming US election late in 1972, Nixon felt he had to hold on to the largely pro-Taiwan base of his own political party, the Republicans. Hence, there is some ambiguity in the communique. There were many other ways as well which the trip advanced both Chinese and US interests, and I'm sure our other panelists will enumerate them. In the communique, each side reassured the other that it did not seek to dominate Asia. In closing, it seems to me that the communique is to be judged by the degree to which it achieved Nixon's goal of, quote, reducing the threat of a confrontation with the Chinese superpower in the future. For reasons I'm sure the panel will describe in further detail, today we see almost all of the reassuring elements of the communique being eroded by both sides. That breakdown could produce the confrontation that Nixon went to China 50 years ago to avoid. We see Beijing and Moscow becoming more strategically cooperative, quite a different alignment than inspired the Shanghai Communique a half-century ago. The Shanghai Communique was about mutual assurance, and today we are moving into an era of mutual deterrence. Thank you very much.